Tonight, we're not just talking about a queen, but about the woman who made all of Europe tread carefully. Elizabeth I, the symbol of power, intellect, and loneliness hidden behind a radiant golden crown. She was a woman living in a man's world, ruling with a sharp smile and a heart scarred by political wounds. But behind the title of the Virgin Queen, what lies within? A clever strategy or a personal tragedy never told. If you love historical stories told differently, deeper, more real, and sometimes more painful, hit subscribe and stay until the end of the video. Because next we'll step into the untold secrets of Elizabeth, the woman who was both a legend and a victim of the very throne she sat upon. Every great story begins with someone underestimated, and Elizabeth I is the most vivid proof of that. In a world where power was measured by how many sons you could bear, the little girl once deemed the king's mistake quietly forged herself into one of the sharpest minds in Europe. The 16th century was an age of darkness and scheming, where the English court resembled a giant chessboard, and Elizabeth, though just a pawn, learned how to become a player. She observed, remembered, stayed silent, skills essential for a woman in the Tudor world, where every smile could be a trap, and every blessing could mark the beginning of a curse. Unlike her contemporaries, Elizabeth had nowhere to run from fear. From a young age, she understood that loyalty could be bought, and affection, especially from a king like her father, only lasted until it became inconvenient. In her letters to tutors, Elizabeth always signed with a firm hand, as if to affirm she would not be forgotten. From long days studying Latin until the sun set to nights reading Greek by candlelight, she sharpened her mind like a warrior honing a blade. It wasn't out of a love for scholarship, it was survival. A child once deemed worthless chose knowledge as armor and silence as her weapon. As she grew older, Elizabeth became what historians would later call a sphinx in human form, mysterious, unpredictable, and always making others feel tested. After living with her stepmother, Catherine Parr, she learned another truth. A woman's power didn't lie in rebellion, but in the ability to make others underestimate her. Elizabeth began to build the image of the obedient daughter, one who cared only for books and scripture. But behind that humble exterior, she quietly watched the powerful men around her and learned how to defeat them with the very tools they used to control her: politics. When her half-brother Edward VI died, England fell into a succession crisis. Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister, ascended the throne and quickly turned the kingdom into a nightmare for Protestants. Blood ran through the streets, executions became religious festivals, and flames consumed heretics across England. Elizabeth, a Protestant under a Catholic queen, suddenly became the greatest threat to her sister's throne. A single rumor was enough to doom her, and eventually it did. In 1554, Elizabeth was escorted to the Tower of London, the same place where her mother had been executed. In the cold of stone and iron, she knew that one wrong confession would end her life like Anne Boleyn's. But Elizabeth did not cry. She wrote to Mary, begging for an audience, but never for pity. "I have nothing to fear but guilt," she wrote, each word sharp as a blade. That calm intelligence saved her life. Mary's advisors, suspicious yet lacking proof of treason, urged the queen to release her. Elizabeth survived. Again. The months of captivity turned her into something else. No longer just a girl who read books, Elizabeth emerged from the tower with colder eyes and something every ruler must possess: the ability to hide emotion. She learned that power wasn't in shouting louder, but in making others fear your silence. From that moment on, Elizabeth never allowed anyone to read her true thoughts again. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth became queen. Yet even as the crown was placed on her head, she understood the throne was no reward. It was a warning. The England she inherited was divided, exhausted, surrounded by enemies within and without. Mighty Spain saw England as easy prey. The Pope in Rome deemed her a heretic. And within her own court, nobles whispered that a woman could not rule a nation. But Elizabeth had been preparing for this moment all her life. She knew that to survive among wolves, you must make them believe you are the bigger one. In her first days of reign, Elizabeth made a decision that would change history. She reestablished the Church of England, breaking from Rome, but without extremes. She chose a middle path, the Elizabethan way, balanced enough to keep religious peace, yet firm enough to assert her authority. It wasn't just a political move. It was a lesson forged from a lifetime of seeing people die for faith. She no longer believed in holy symbols. She believed in stability, the one luxury her childhood had never known. Elizabeth's palace was not only a seat of power, but a stage where she choreographed every glance and word. She never married. Not out of arrogance, but because she knew marriage meant surrendering control. In a world where women existed only through the men beside them, Elizabeth chose to be the exception. "I have married England," she declared, and Europe fell silent, a statement that was both a political manifesto and an act of self-preservation. But behind that confidence lay a terrible cost. She was lonely, mistrusted, and constantly forced to express emotion in ways men never were. Every decision, every frown was dissected as a sign of weakness or madness. And Elizabeth, who had survived rumors and imprisonment, knew the only way to keep power was to accept that no one would ever truly understand her. She became a symbol of strength, but also of solitude. When the candles in the palace burned low, only the sound of Elizabeth's pen remained, writing letters, diaries, decrees, a woman carrying a kingdom on her shoulders, with the wounds of an abandoned child still in her heart. And perhaps that is the true secret of the Virgin Queen. Not that she never loved, but that she loved something greater than any man: power and survival. In her court, every whisper could become a dagger. Every laugh, every glance, every sealed letter could decide the fate of a person or a nation. Elizabeth knew that better than anyone because she herself had once been the target. The throne was never a place to sit, but a thin rope stretched between worship and betrayal. She walked that rope every day, head held high, smile flawless, hiding fear as if it never existed. The old advisors bowed before her, but in their eyes always lingered an unspoken question. How long can a woman rule England? That question was the blade she learned to sharpen. Elizabeth didn't just rule, she orchestrated. She turned her gender, once seen as a weakness, into her greatest weapon. Whenever royal ambassadors tried to read her, they found only layers of masks: femininity, charm, sweetness, before realizing that behind them lay an intellect sharper than any sword they carried. The kings of Europe whispered in their halls about the Virgin Queen as if she were an enigma. But Elizabeth knew exactly what she was doing. She made them all wait, guess, and doubt one another. And in that hesitation, England had time to breathe, rebuild, and prepare for the storms to come. Every postponed marriage proposal was a new treaty signed. Every rumor of romance was a diplomatic strike delivered at the perfect moment. And while they argued over who would win her heart, Elizabeth quietly claimed the seas. As English ships began to cross the Atlantic, bringing back gold and silver from the New World, Elizabeth understood that power did not lie in the crown, but on the map. She supported explorers like Francis Drake, both pirate and national hero, as long as the spoils were shared with the crown. Every stolen Spanish coin was not just wealth, but a message: England has awakened. She didn't need a massive fleet, she only needed will, and men bold enough to die for their honor. Yet the greater the power, the deeper the loneliness. When night fell and the palace grew silent, Elizabeth looked into the mirror and saw her own pale face staring back. The lead-based powder made her glow in candlelight, but it also cracked and burned her skin. Her red lips, carefully painted, hid their trembling. And in those rare moments when no one was watching, she allowed herself to be weak for only a few breaths. Then she donned the queen's mask again the next morning, like a warrior putting on armor before a new battle. Times changed. The Spanish Empire, her mother's old enemy, began to look north with hatred in its eyes. They called her a heretic, a crowned demon, a threat to the faith of Christendom. Philip II, the king who had once sought her hand, now sent the largest fleet in the world toward the English Channel. And Elizabeth, who had once been imprisoned and faced death, stood before her army in silver armor, riding along the lines and declaring, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England." Those words were not a speech, they were a declaration of survival. She knew her fleet was weaker, smaller, but she also knew England was fighting for its very soul. When the winds changed, the Spanish ships were shattered, and the sea sang her name. All of Europe bowed, not just to the Queen, but to the symbol she had become: Elizabeth, the woman who dared to face the mightiest empire in the world and triumphed. From that moment, she was no longer the ruler of a nation. She was its embodiment. Her image covered coins, paintings, and songs of the people. Elizabeth the Eternal, they called her that, and for the first time, they might have truly believed it. But the price of immortality is always loneliness. Robert Dudley was dead, her old friends were gone, and the court remained full of pretenders. She grew old, but never allowed anyone to say so. Every portrait was retouched, her face never wrinkled, even as time carved itself deep into her bones. Every night she sat alone in an empty room by a flickering candle, rereading the old letters from Dudley, the only man she had ever allowed herself to love but could never be with. The ink had faded, but the memories had not. Elizabeth did not cry. She only stared into the distance, as if counting the silences between the cheers. To the world, she was a light that never went out. But in her mind, that light had become a fire, slowly burning away what remained of her humanity. And though her court still glittered with flags flying and bells ringing, Elizabeth knew that all power would eventually fade. The only thing that remained was the way she made them remember her. Not as a fragile woman once abandoned by her father, but as an eternal flame, one that both illuminated and consumed. That was the true legacy of Elizabeth I, not the throne, not the victory over the Spanish Armada, but the ability to turn pain into symbol. In a world where women were treated as commodities, she carved her name into history with intellect, resolve, and a smile that knew its own worth. And when her era ended, her successors could sit upon the throne, but none could ever take the place she had created. When age begins to lurk at the edge of the candlelight, you realize that time can take away everything, except memory. Your court continues to pretend that nothing has changed. Collars are sewn higher to hide the thinning neck, velvet curtains are hung thicker to soften the light, and portraits are painted so carefully that even death himself would no longer recognize your true face. But you know, every morning is a silent negotiation between youth and pride. In that palace, you are the last one left of an era. Those who once loved you, served you, defied you, all have returned to the earth. The footsteps in the corridors now echo only with ghosts. Each time you pass the great mirror in the audience hall, you wonder who the woman staring back truly is. Elizabeth, Queen of England, or merely the shadow of a legend you yourself created. The young courtiers look at you with a mix of reverence and pity. They speak of you in grand titles, Mother of the Nation, Goddess of England. But when you turn your back, they whisper about how empty the throne will be once you're gone. You don't blame them. You too were once like them, standing in the shadow of an old reign, waiting for your moment. The only difference is now no one seems worthy of the waiting anymore. Time has made you dangerous in another way, not because of power, but because of loneliness. You have ruled too long to remember how to live as an ordinary person. Everyone in the palace is a memory given form. New faces only remind you of those who are gone. When you speak to them, you are not really speaking to the present. You are conversing with the ghosts of yourself. Rumors about your health begin to spread, subtle as breath through lace. Some say you are no longer fit to rule. Others claim you have gone mad, that the lead from your makeup has seeped into your blood and made your heart falter. You laugh when you hear such words because they are partly true. Yet somewhere, in the sleepless nights, you too begin to hear your heartbeat as a reminder. Even a queen cannot command time. You no longer attend banquets. The light, the music, and the wine exhaust you. Instead, you choose to remain in the small room where old portraits hang. There, you talk to your younger self, the girl who once swore never to yield, never to marry, never to cry. She looks back at you from the frame with bright eyes and a flawless face. You envy her, then pity her, for she does not yet know that eternity is merely another form of suffering. But even in decline, you rule with a sharp mind. You know that a kingdom cannot afford an empty throne. You think of your successor, James, the son of Mary Stuart, the woman you ordered to die. Ironically, fate has chosen the child of your enemy to inherit your legacy. Perhaps history is cruel, or perhaps it just has a taste for dark humor. You command that everything be prepared carefully, because England must not see chaos, not while you still live. One morning, you refuse to eat. The maids beg, but you only shake your head. The body that once symbolized power is now too weary, longing only for rest. You ask them to leave you alone. not in ceremony, not in prayer, but in silence, a silence you were never allowed to have in your entire life. As dusk falls, you sit in your chair, holding an old letter from Dudley. The candlelight dances across the ink you never dared to read. Perhaps it is a farewell, or a confession, or simply a wish for peace. Whatever it is, you understand that love, the thing you once sacrificed for the throne, has always existed, only never been named. That night, the palace is utterly still. The servants wait outside, afraid to enter. When they find you, you are still seated in the same chair, head tilted slightly, as if listening to a distant melody. The crown no longer rests upon your head, but lies quietly on the table. Your face, though pale, still holds a smile, a mysterious smile, as if you had just outwitted history itself. The next morning, England wakes in silence. The people fill the streets, not to celebrate, but to mourn. They no longer see the woman of flesh and blood, but the symbol, Elizabeth the Eternal. Poets write of you as a star that has faded, yet whose light remains. Painters continue to portray your face white as pearl, your eyes bright as steel. No one paints the wrinkles, no one mentions the fear, and no one says that you died alone, because that is not how legends are made. And so you achieve what all kings, queens, and tyrants desire: immortality. Not through blood, but through memory. Not through power, but through story. Each time someone speaks your name, whether in praise or in irony, you live one more day in their minds. You are no longer Elizabeth the woman. You are Elizabeth the idea, the embodiment of power, solitude, and pride bound by duty. That is the price of becoming a legend. You conquer time itself, but lose yourself. And if your spirit still wanders the old halls of the palace, perhaps you are still smiling, the smile of one who knows that, in the end, nothing is more terrifying than being remembered forever. After the last breath left Elizabeth's lips, it seemed as if England itself stopped breathing with her. But as the final light of the Tudor dynasty faded, another darkness began to creep across Europe. Not the darkness of politics, but of death itself. Death, like a patient actor, had been waiting for its turn on stage. And in 1347, it found its greatest role, the Black Death. If Elizabeth was the symbol of immortal power, then the Black Death was the reminder that even empires, religions, and monarchies are but dust beneath the feet of fate. It chose no victims. Rich or poor, king or peasant, priest or beggar, all shared the same scent, the smell of decay. Medieval cities, already crowded and foul, now became vast cauldrons simmering with fear. In Florence, people said the streets were so silent that the sound of a horse's hooves echoed like the heartbeat of a dying soul. In Paris, crosses hung above doorways, but no god ever entered. And in London, the Thames flowed slowly, carrying heavy cloth sacks everyone knew the contents of, but no one dared to look. People believed the plague came from poisoned air, the breath of the earth itself, enraged by human sin. Doctors in beaked masks moved through the streets like wandering spirits, burning incense, sprinkling vinegar, and mumbling Latin incantations. They resembled sorcerers more than physicians. But in truth, they were merely human, afraid, helpless, and hiding their fear behind ritual. The people began to despair. When prayers no longer worked, they turned to other methods: rubbing garlic on their skin, wearing charms, drinking animal blood, or inhaling the smoke of candles made from human fat. They believed that if they could endure the stench of hell, hell might spare them. Uh, but hell does not negotiate. In distant villages, the sound of singing rose from groups of flagellants. They walked barefoot along roads slick with mud and blood, whipping their backs raw, believing that if they suffered for the world, God would relent. But the wrath continued, and their blood only mingled with the dark puddles beneath their feet. In those days, even beauty became terrifying. Roses, the symbol of love and purity, were crushed and scattered over corpses to mask the stench of rot. That fragrance, once a prayer, became a sign that death was near. People said when the scent of roses grew too strong, the plague had reached your street. Some tried to flee. They left the cities, carrying with them the hope that green fields and clean air might save them. But the roads, littered with corpses, blocked their way. And when the plague reached a village, it did not need to knock. One sneeze, one handshake, one passing breeze was enough to decide a fate. In Venice, merchants burned their goods and even their warehouses, believing that fire would purge the sin that carried the plague. But in those flames, you could see a colder truth. that humanity would burn the world itself just to keep one more breath. Historians later called it the collapse of faith. But for those who lived through it, it was just another ordinary day, a day when your neighbor died and you wondered if you would wake tomorrow. Then something strange happened. Art flourished. When everything else was erased, people began to paint death, as if by turning fear into image, they could control it. The dance of death appeared across Europe, skeletons dancing with kings, peasants, and priests. It was the only dance where everyone was equal. But if you listen closely, between the church bells and the cawing of crows, you can hear another voice, soft, thin, and proud. The voice of Elizabeth. Not Elizabeth, the flesh and blood queen, but the idea of her, the lingering shadow of a woman who once defied time itself. In later folklore, they said her spirit walked through plague-ridden streets without fear. She came not to judge or to save, but to witness, as if to say that even when death reigns, humanity can still live forever through story. The Black Death eventually withdrew, not because of science, but because it was sated. More than half of Europe vanished. Yet, from its ashes, humanity learned one thing, that existence is not just survival, it is leaving a mark. From the ruins of the plague, the ideas of humanism, medicine, and Renaissance art arose, flowers blooming from the soil of the dead. And if Elizabeth understood anything better than anyone, it was this: death never truly ends a reign. It only opens the next chapter of memory. So when you see old paintings of goddesses or queens in golden light, remember, they are not just portraits, they are humanity's defiance of death. They are how we say, we will be remembered, even if only in our own nightmares. Thus, the story of Elizabeth, the woman who lived to become legend, and the legend who became a spirit in the darkest of times, is not just a page of history. It is a mirror reflecting ourselves, the ones still pretending to be immortal, in a world still full of things eager to erase memory. As the smoke from the last pyres faded, Europe entered a strange silence. The streets no longer echoed with the steady ringing of church bells, and the once bustling markets now carried only the lonely footsteps of survivors. Amid the ashes of faith and bodies, people began to look inward, not with the eyes of fear anymore, but with the eyes of those who had lost everything, including innocence. Death had spared no one. From peasants to nobles, from priests to kings, all had knelt before an invisible power that could not be bargained with. The fields lay abandoned. The farms stood empty. Every shuttered house looked like an unmarked grave. Yet within that emptiness, something began to germinate. Not faith, but doubt. People started to ask, if God is almighty, why did he allow half of his world to be wiped out? That question, small as it was, shook the very foundation of an age. For when faith trembles, the order of society begins to crack. Monasteries, once sanctuaries of safety, were now filled with the corpses of monks. They had prayed themselves to exhaustion, but prayer saved no one. The survivors turned their backs on the church, seeking more practical methods, control, laws, and science, though they did not yet know they were inventing it. Some cities introduced the first sanitation measures in European history, cleaning streets, burying corpses, banning gatherings. These small acts saved more lives than thousands of hymns. In Florence, scholars quietly recorded everything: symptoms, timing, and the ways the plague spread. Meanwhile, in England, chroniclers wrote down not the names of kings, but the number of deaths each week. History from then on was no longer the story of power, but the record of survival. It was in that terrible time that the seeds of scientific thought first took root. The survivors no longer believed solely in divine will. They began to believe that disease could be understood, and if understood, it could be fought. However, this awakening did not come easily. When old faith collapsed, humanity needed a new faith to cling to, and they found it in extremism. Some groups believed the end of the world had come, that the Black Death was God's wrath, and that only through purging humanity with blood and fire could the world be cleansed of sin. In parts of Germany, new fanatic sects arose, preaching that by destroying the sinful, pagans, Jews, even widows, humanity could be redeemed. History would later call this one of its darkest chapters, when fear drove men to kill each other in the name of salvation. Meanwhile, the rulers fared no better. Kings tried to restore order through lavish ceremonies, national funerals, and promises of resurrection. But when people saw royalty hiding behind quarantined fortress walls, They understood that no one was immortal. The collapse of divine authority paved the way for another kind of power, the power of humanity. From the ashes of the Black Death, ideas of humanism, freedom, and knowledge began to rise. No one knew that centuries later it would be called the Renaissance. Yet this awakening was not a glorious revolution, but a painful rebirth. Humanity learned to face its own mortality. Art shifted from images of saints to real faces, people in pain, afraid, but still alive. Literature began to speak of loneliness, sorrow, and the yearning to understand the world. Beauty, for the first time, was no longer synonymous with perfection, but with truth. And in the dark corners of Europe, where alchemists still tried mixing mercury with blood to trick disease, a few names began to rewrite medicine. They did not believe in miracles, but in observation. They experimented, failed, and tried again. They dissected the dead, a blasphemous act, just to understand how the body worked. Bit by bit, they were lifting the veil that faith had laid over truth for thousands of years. It was not the triumph of reason over religion, but a compromise. People no longer asked, "Why does God punish us?" but "What can we do to survive?" That question, simple yet profound, changed history. From flagellating pilgrims seeking redemption, humanity became observers and healers. It was a long and bloody journey, but not a meaningless one, for the Black Death, in the cruelest way possible, had taught humanity the value of life. It forced Europe to confront its limits, and then to rise from them. When the final smoke vanished, new candles were lit, not to pray, but to illuminate. And that light, faint yet enduring, was what would guide humanity into a new age. When the world was plunged into the panic of the Black Death, people found comfort in things so bizarre they were almost pitiful. They did not fight the plague with swords or prayers alone, but with vinegar, fragrance, and delusion. From the musty markets of Florence to the narrow alleys of London, rumors spread of a miraculous potion that could deceive death itself, the vinegar of four thieves. The name sounded like a joke, but the story behind it was told with near religious reverence. It was said that four thieves had survived looting plague-ridden homes without falling ill, and their secret lay in the vinegar mixture they had concocted. No one knew the true recipe. In one place, it was vinegar mixed with garlic and rosemary. Elsewhere, wormwood, lavender, and hope, the taste of survival. Vinegar became a precious commodity, a talisman that could be bought with a few silver coins. Cunning merchants retold the tale of the four thieves as if it were the gospel of survivors, while buyers poured into their bottles the illusion that they had just tricked the apocalypse itself. The more desperate the times, the more insane the remedies. People rubbed vinegar onto open wounds, washed their food until the bread fell apart, even inhaled vinegar directly through their noses. A kind of medieval spa for souls that were either truly brave or truly desperate. The nobility, as always, turned it into a luxurious ritual. They carried silver cloth soaked in vinegar, stored in pearl-inlaid boxes, pressing them to their noses when servants coughed. The gesture was no different from a declaration. I am rich, I am fragrant, and I will not die. Yet amid such naive beliefs flickered a small spark of reason. For vinegar, ironically, truly did have the power to kill certain bacteria, just not the one that had brought Europe to its knees. In an age when no one even knew what germs were, the fact that they accidentally chose a natural disinfectant was almost miraculous. Though its effect was minimal, it was one of those rare moments in history when superstition accidentally brushed against science. But when vinegar and herbs failed, human eyes turned upward. If medicine could not save them, perhaps only miracles could. The church became the hospital of the soul. Every candle was lit not only to illuminate, but to negotiate. People knelt in tears, whispering vows to Saint Sebastian, the saint who was shot with dozens of arrows, yet survived. A perfect metaphor for the time. Those arrows, in the eyes of the people, were the invisible punishments of God. If Sebastian could endure them, perhaps they could too. Statues of the arrow-pierced saint were passed from village to village. People kissed the wooden feet, clutching them to their chests, as if embracing hope itself. Meanwhile, priests led endless processions, holding relics, chanting prayers for mercy. In Avignon, church bells rang through the night. In Florence, the faithful walked barefoot around the squares, burning incense and singing hymns. All of Europe had become one vast chapel. The Pope decreed global prayers across Christendom, even blessing the Tiber River in hopes that holy water might carry grace downstream. But the Black Death was no devout believer. It did not distinguish between the pious and the wicked. Even the ascetic monks who lived only on bread and prayer fell one by one. When faith could no longer save anyone, people began to doubt whether God was listening or if he too was in quarantine. And when heaven stayed silent, people turned back to their own bodies. Medieval medicine, with its belief in the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, claimed that illness came from imbalance. The solution? Bloodletting, a simple, elegant, and deadly method. Doctors, clad in long black robes, sharpened their blades with the firm belief that as long as the blood flowed out, life would return. To them, a pale patient was not dying, but recovering. The nobles were treated in silvered chambers with rosemary-soaked bandages, while the poor were cut with dull blades on wooden tables. In small towns, barbers doubled as doctors, shaving beards, trimming hair, and opening veins all in the same morning. The symbol of the red and white pole still exists today, a relic of that age. The red for blood, the white for bandages, and its spiral a reminder that medicine once believed healing began by making people bleed. Sometimes, when one bleeding did not work, doctors repeated the process daily until the patient stabilized, which usually meant death. But in desperation, people still paid, still prayed, still believed. Refusing treatment meant sin, and sin had to be paid for. In many places, authorities forced the infected to follow protocols, a polite term for being bled to exhaustion. Then, when blood was not enough, people turned to something else: scent. If disease spread through the air, perhaps fragrance could protect them. From the nobles to the poor, Europe drowned in a frenzy of perfume. Markets overflowed with sachets, incense, and floral wax. Women carried small metal balls called pomanders, filled with cloves, cinnamon, and vinegar. Each time they passed a corpse, they lifted the ball to their noses and inhaled deeply, as if the scent could filter death itself. The upper class bathed in amber and musk oils, while the poor wore garlic necklaces, turning the streets into a massive feast of smells, a mix of decay and hope. Cities sprinkled vinegar on the roads, burned aromatic woods in public squares, and called it public health. Venice gave priority to spice ships over grain ships, believing cinnamon could save the soul. The result? No one was saved. But in that failure, humanity learned the most important lesson, that they were trying. They did not simply accept death, they resisted it in every way possible, with vinegar, with blood, with fragrance, and with faith. In desperation, humanity had created, and from those mistakes, the first seeds of science, of hygiene, and of understanding began to sprout. The northern sky has never been gentle. It growls, casting shadows over lands jagged with rock and snow, where humans learn to survive before they learn to pray. After Lindisfarne, other coastal villages began to tremble. From Northumbria to Jarrow, rumors spread like cold wind. The dragon-headed ships had returned. People said they glided across the sea like ghosts, that those who steered them feared no death because Valhalla awaited them. For the Anglo-Saxons, that was the day when the boundary between legend and reality dissolved. The Christian world then was as fragile as candle wax, fragmented kingdoms divided by local lords and fragile loyalties. When the Vikings came, they didn't just steal gold and silver, they stole something far more valuable: the sense of safety. And when those ships vanished beyond the horizon, they left behind a scar. A world that once believed in God's protection now began to wonder if God had turned away. In Scandinavia, where the wind cut like knives and the sun was only a faint promise, faith burned with a different flame. They believed death was not an end, but a doorway to Valhalla, the Hall of Heroes. Every soul that fell in battle would be carried there by the Valkyries to stand beside Odin. In that world, raiding was not sin, it was trial. Every swing of a blade was a prayer, every scream a hymn of iron and steel. There was no Bible there, only blood and word of mouth. Children grew up hearing tales of Ragnar Lothbrok, who crossed the seas to challenge southern kings. They learned to row before they could read, to read clouds before they read books, and to know that honor was the only thing that could not be stolen. So when news came of monasteries overflowing with gold and lacking soldiers, they did not feel guilt. They felt destiny. The attacks spread like disease. In Iona, another monastery was burned just 2 years after Lindisfarne. In Ireland, the invaders began to settle, bringing with them their customs, language, and nightmares. But what terrified Europe most was not their strength, it was their disappearance. The Vikings came and went like ghosts, without negotiation, leaving behind nothing but bodies. No one knew where they came from, only that they carried with them the chill of the world's end. To understand them, we must understand the roots of that storm. In the 8th century, Scandinavia's population exploded, farmland grew scarce, and power was split among tribal chieftains. In a society where honor and wealth measured status, the sea became the final frontier. But sailing the northern seas was no journey for the faint-hearted. It was a test of will, a gateway to prove one's worth before the gods. And when you live in a world that believes every victory is decided by divine will, failure is not an option. That is how the Viking Code was born. Not a religion, but a philosophy of survival. A strong man must dare to raid, dare to conquer, and dare to die beautifully. Their idea of beauty was the clash of steel on bone, the oar striking the waves, the fire burning against the dark. And from within that darkness, Europe realized something terrifying. These were not chaotic savages. These were craftsmen, tacticians, patient and precise. Their longships were feats of engineering, narrow, light, curved at the prow, able to land in waters only a few meters deep. They needed no harbors, no signals, only a horizon. Each ship carried about 50 men, each both sailor and warrior. While the Anglo-Saxons waited for summer to march, the Vikings came and were gone before the rooster crowed. They were thunder in the night, unseen and unstoppable. Yet within that brutality lay the seed of civilization. The pirates slowly became traders, then settlers. In Dublin, they built markets. In York, they raised houses. In Normandy, they signed treaties with French kings. From hands once wielding axes, cities were born. What Europe called barbaric darkness turned out to be the dawn of commerce, of cultural blending of a new age. And then, in a cruel circle, the Vikings themselves began to change. They started to believe in the God they once mocked. Christian missionaries who had once fled from them now crossed the sea to Scandinavia. And strangely, the Vikings listened. Perhaps because they were already familiar with the concept of fate, and in the Bible, they found another way to face destiny, not through blood, but through redemption. But that transformation did not happen overnight. It was a marriage of iron and cross, of faith and strength. Their graves, once filled with weapons and axes, began to hold silver crosses. On church walls across Europe, artists painted images of northern warriors kneeling, and beneath the sea, their dragon-headed ships slowly sank, covered in seaweed and memory. The world changed. Death, plague, raids, all were different ways humans faced what they could not control. Yet beneath the ashes of that age lay a deeper truth. Every civilization begins with fear. From that fear, humans forged myths, cast weapons, and wrote prayers. And sometimes, as in Lindisfarne, when dawn rises over blackened ruins, we realize that history never dies. It only changes its form. After Lindisfarne, not only the charred stones of the monastery remained, what was left was a crack in the soul of Europe. A world that once believed faith was the strongest fortress now had to face a stark truth. Pagan could tear it apart with nothing but steel and will. For generations, monks had written hymns praising mercy. But in northern Europe, a different kind of scripture was being written, in axe blows, blood, and sea wind. The first reports of the raid reached Canterbury, then Rome. Bishops panicked, writing urgent letters to emperors and popes. The enemy has come from the direction where the sun sets, a place no Christian has ever set foot. In their imagination, they were not men, but demons sent to punish. Yet it was precisely that fear that changed Europe. For the first time, people realized that the sea, once thought to divide the world, had become a road. And those who could master it would hold the power to shape history. Coastal villages built watchtowers. Monasteries thickened their stone walls, hiding relics deep in the woods. Rulers imposed a new tax called Danegeld, gold for the Danes, a payment to buy back peace. But peace was a luxury for those who lived by the storm. The Vikings did not see gold as a reward, it was merely an invitation. The more gold, the more reason to return. Meanwhile, in the north, new songs rose. By the firesides, poets, the skalds, told of Lindisfarne in deep, rhythmic voices like hammer strikes. They praised the bravery of their chieftain, describing the flames on the rooftops as the light guiding them to Valhalla. To them, it was not a sin, but the first triumph of a people on the verge of legend. Those stories spread from ear to ear, from valley to valley, and soon all of Scandinavia knew of the island of the monks, the place where a strange god had been tested. When summer returned, dragon-headed ships cut through the waves again. Each raid was more refined, more ruthless, and more terrifying. They no longer targeted treasures, but faith itself. In 794, the monastery of Iona, once a great center of learning in Scotland, was burned. 2 years later, Noirmoutier in France met the same fate. The fires spread with the wind, and with the smoke, a new concept was born. The fear of the Northmen, a fear that crossed borders, even religions. Yet among the ashes of the churches, another seed was sprouting. The survivors, scholars, monks, scribes, began leaving the coasts, carrying knowledge inland. Unknowingly, they became the sowers of Europe's cultural revival. When knowledge left its safe harbor, it spread. When churches fell, the spirit of learning began to wander. And in that paradox, the Vikings, though they never intended it, awakened Europe from a centuries-long slumber of superstition. Meanwhile, the wind kept blowing in the north. In the villages along Norway's fjords, young men listened to tales of Lindisfarne like glowing dreams. They imagined the sea not as a boundary, but as a road. To them, Europe was not a holy land, but a promised one. The next generation began to prepare, forging more axes, building more ships. And so, from a single attack, an entire civilization set sail. The 9th century became the age of sails. Along the Seine, the Rhine, the Loire, dragon ships appeared like mirages. They slipped inland, navigating rivers no one believed could be sailed. To Christians, it was a dark miracle. To the Vikings, it was skill, the result of centuries living with the sea. They were not just warriors, they were engineers, explorers, and at times, merchants. The first Europeans to build ships capable of crossing oceans, not the Romans, but them. When blood stopped flowing, trade began. Viking ports sprang up in Dublin, York, Hedeby. Silver from Arabia, silk from Byzantium, furs from Greenland, all met in the hands of those once called savages. Europe did not realize that in its panic, it had opened the door to rebirth. Behind every burning was an exchange. Behind every sword was a new trade route. The Vikings did not just destroy the old order, they reshaped it. But the strangest thing of all was this. Those who once scorned the cross began to grow curious about it. As they settled in England, France, and Ireland, missionaries came, not with swords, but with words. And in Viking villages, the first children were baptized. No one could have known that only a few generations later, the descendants of those raiders would become kings of Christian kingdoms. Harald Bluetooth, the king who united Denmark, would carve into a rune stone, "He made the Danes Christians." From Lindisfarne to Bluetooth was only 2 centuries, 200 years, for a culture to move from axe to cross. But that process was not submission, it was integration. The Vikings did not abandon their gods, they wove them into their new faith. In Scandinavian art, the cross was carved alongside the serpent Jormungandr, and thus, instead of vanishing, the northern spirit lived on, hidden in tales of knights, crusades, and later in the very fabric of modern European culture. The Lindisfarne raid, therefore, did not just begin an age of blood and iron. It began an age of encounters, a violent collision between two worlds, faith and instinct, light and darkness, hymns and axes. No one knows who truly won. But if you listen closely, between the church bells and the sea waves, you can still hear the echo of that meeting, where the history of Europe was no longer written only by saints, but also by those who dared to challenge them. In those distant colonies, the line between life and death was so thin that one could feel it in every breath. Tropical fevers, dysentery, and smallpox were invisible predators, stalking everyone from the docks to the deep jungles. Medicine was scarce, and the understanding of the human body was still bound by ancient beliefs. Doctors, if they could be called that, were not only healers, but also prophets, sorcerers, and sometimes executioners in the name of medicine. In the dusty villages of British India or among the plantations of the Caribbean, a familiar image was that of men in leather coats, knives in hand, standing beside blood-stained wooden tables where patients were tied down, praying for a miracle or at least a quick death. Anesthesia did not exist. Every operation was an open torture. People clenched their teeth or bit into a piece of wood to keep from screaming. A good doctor was one who could cut fast, clean, and with as little blood as possible. Not out of compassion, but because speed was the only thing that could save a patient from shock and blood loss. In military outposts, soldiers would joke bitterly. If you're wounded, pray to die on the spot. Don't let the doctor touch you. Yet it was precisely in those harsh conditions that the first steps of modern medicine were born. Barber surgeons lacking resources were forced to innovate. They experimented with rum for disinfection, used sewing needles to stitch human skin, and recorded every result, success or disaster, in sweat-stained notebooks. Many of them didn't know they were writing history. They were simply trying to survive another day, as the bodies lying around the field hospitals reminded them that failure was always near. In the Caribbean, the heat and insects turned even the smallest wound into a nest of infection. Doctors learned to cauterize cuts with red-hot iron to prevent gangrene. In India, they experimented with local herbs, mixing them with indigenous remedies, a blend of primitive science and folk magic. Some worked miraculously well, others poisoned or drove patients insane. Every experiment was paid for in blood, and sometimes with the life of the one performing it. As empires expanded, medicine became a tool of rule. Healing was not just about saving lives, but about maintaining order. A healthy plantation was a profitable plantation. The colonial doctors thus became extensions of imperial power, studying the bodies of native peoples with the cold detachment of an anatomist dissecting nameless corpses. They recorded features, bone structures, skin colors, physical endurance, then used them to justify racism under the guise of science. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of medical experiments on slaves and colonized subjects, dark chapters that Western history would later bow its head to. Meanwhile, in Europe, prestigious medical schools like Edinburgh and Paris began to admit those who had returned from the colonies. They brought with them experience and scars. Their notes on battlefield surgery, malaria, and cholera became invaluable material. Many great medical advancements were built upon those rough observations. From makeshift operating rooms in Africa and India, the concepts of sterilization, anesthesia, and epidemic control slowly took form. The price of that progress, however, was countless unnamed lives. Another equally haunting image was that of the medical ships, floating hospitals adrift at sea. Inside, the smell of blood, alcohol, and sweat clung to every plank. Each surgery took place amid the roar of waves and screams. Some survived, but many were wrapped in cloth and dropped into the ocean right after. Cruel as they were, those ships became the birthplace of pioneering techniques, disinfecting surgical tools, controlling infections, and managing patients systematically. Medicine, even in darkness, still moved forward. But strangely, amid the chaos, there were still those who truly believed they were doing good. They wrote letters home, telling of saving a child by amputating a gangrenous limb or discovering a new medicine from local tree bark. Those stories were reprinted in scientific journals, sometimes celebrated as medical miracles. Few knew that behind each miracle was a terrible cost: involuntary experiments, bodies donated without consent. As the world entered the 19th century, medicine gradually shed its cloak of superstition but never fully escaped the shadow of ethics. Imperial experiments continued, only more subtly. In India, vaccines were tested on prisoners. In Africa, doctors surveyed diseases for military use. And in Europe, anatomists still secretly bought corpses from grave robbers for night classes. Science had advanced, but humanity remained behind. Yet from that murky ground emerged figures like Edward Jenner, Florence Nightingale, and Joseph Lister, people who carried lessons from darkness to bring forth light. Jenner learned from farmers about cowpox and created the vaccine. Nightingale, who had witnessed the hell of military hospitals, turned it into a revolution in healthcare. Lister introduced antisepsis to the world, an idea once deemed insane. Each of these breakthroughs was the result of generations who had cut, stitched, and lost in despair. Looking back, colonial medicine is a double image, both a dark chapter of imperialism and the foundation of human progress. It shows that advancement is never linear, but always shadowed by darkness. Every discovery, every new cure has an origin somewhere, perhaps in a blood-soaked field hospital or in the hands of a forgotten native healer. And if one listens closely, one can still hear the echoes of that past in modern medicine itself, where every sterile syringe, every clean operating table stands as proof that humanity has learned, sometimes at the highest price, how to heal itself. In the colonial world, where the line between medicine and magic blurred like the smoke in a tavern, rum was more than a drink. It was a philosophy of life, a belief, the ultimate remedy for everything. When all else failed, people turned to the bottle. And surgeons, those barbers with conscience, used it as if it were God's answer to every wound. Rum needed no prescription, no preservation, and never complained when abused. In those small rooms thick with the smell of blood and sweat, the pop of a cork was easier to hear than a prayer. An operation began not with a prayer, but with the sound of rum being poured into a glass. The doctor dipped his knife into the rum, wiped it with a cloth, then hurriedly signaled two men to hold the patient tight. Ready? A rhetorical question no one dared to answer. When the blade cut down, the world narrowed into a single moment, between screams, the saw's rasp, and the rum sloshing in the bottle. If the patient woke up after a few days, the doctor would smile smugly. If not, he would simply sigh and say, "At least he died sober." But sometimes, amid the scent of rum and blood, something close to science flickered to life. A few curious doctors began to wonder if there was more than balancing humors and bad blood. They observed, took notes, compared. One noticed that wounds washed with rum rotted less. Another recorded that boiled water cleaned tools better than cold well water. No one called it sterilization, but the first fragments of modern medicine quietly emerged from that chaos. In the colonies, not every doctor was cruel. Some truly believed in the mission to heal, even without schools, equipment, or the latest books from London. They wandered between plantations, crossed swamps, carrying rusty toolboxes and fragile hope. They treated slaves, sailors, lepers, and were sometimes paid only with chickens or sugar. They didn't know the concept of bacteria, but they knew human fear, and sometimes a hand placed on a shoulder was part of the cure. The bravest among them began to learn from indigenous medicine. The natives taught them how to use willow bark, what Europe would later call aspirin. They showed colonial doctors that clay could draw out poison, that smoke from dried leaves could soothe a cough, and that sometimes the body didn't need to be bled, only rested. But every time a doctor used an indigenous remedy, he knew he was walking a dangerous line between God and superstition, between science and heresy. The 17th century had no laboratories, but it had war. And the battlefield, though horrific, was where medicine learned to grow up. Amid cannon fire and gunpowder smoke, surgeons learned to cut faster, stitch tighter, and most importantly, observe more. They saw that those with minor wounds survived, while those operated on often died. They began to doubt the ancient theory of humors, which had shackled European medicine for thousands of years. Every wound washed with rum and healed was a small piece of evidence against the past. And bit by bit, science began to slip in between rum, blood, and prayer. Yet for ordinary people, medicine remained distant. Most illnesses were treated with experience and rumor. A woman with fever was told to wear a charm made from a hunting dog's nails. A child with a cough would be fumigated with tobacco smoke. A wounded soldier had a mixture of ash and rum applied to his cut. No one truly understood why it sometimes worked, and that only deepened the mystery of the healing art. Death could come at any moment, but if you survived, it was surely by the grace of God, or at least thanks to rum. And within that chaos, a new generation of healers emerged. They were no longer just barbers or quacks, but people who began to see the link between cause and effect. They realized that better hygiene meant longer lives, that a clean knife saved more lives than a sharp one, that caution was worth more than rum. In some colonies, makeshift hospitals were built, at first converted from barns, but gradually organized with record keepers and patient charts. Those records later became treasures. When doctors returned from Europe, they were astonished by what the natives had discovered: how to use leaves to ease pain, how to bandage wounds with clean cloth, how to use smoke to drive away mosquitoes, and thus prevent malaria. None of this appeared in medical textbooks from Oxford or Paris, but it worked in practice. The colonies, lands deemed backward, had inadvertently become the first laboratories for empirical medicine. As the 18th century dawned, rum still flowed freely, but the tone of medicine had changed. Prayers began to give way to observation. Healers began to grasp the concept of infection, though not fully understand it. And the barber surgeons, men who once sawed off limbs on wooden tables, now began to wash their hands. There was still pain, but amid the screams, the first questions about cause, evidence, and science could be heard. None of them knew they were living at the dawn of modern medicine. To them, it was just daily work, a cut, a glass of rum, a fragile hope. But it was these people, the barber surgeons, the native healers, the reckless colonial doctors fighting to keep patients alive through the night, who unwittingly opened the path toward a world where scalpels would be clean, anesthesia would exist, and life would no longer have to be bought with pain. Colonial medicine left no grand monuments, but it left an invisible legacy, the resilience of humankind in the face of its own darkness. In every drop of rum poured over a wound, in every prayer mingled with screams, lay the first step in the long journey toward the realization that it was not God but humans themselves who could heal. They said smallpox did not choose victims, it chose memories. When it swept through the coastal settlements, it destroyed not only human bodies, but erased entire histories, line by line. Indigenous villages disappeared after a single winter. Flourishing plantations turned desolate, churches became burial grounds, and every child born amid the epidemic carried within them a warning that civilization was far more fragile than people believed. For the survivors, smallpox was an invisible monster, an enemy that could not be cut, shot, or persuaded. Its scars were not only on the skin, they lived in nightmares, in the memories of trembling hands touching the cold foreheads of loved ones. When the epidemic struck, colonial cities like Philadelphia and Boston fell silent. Church bells rang so often that people could no longer tell weekdays from funerals. And in that despair, doctors, those who called themselves warriors of reason, began to panic as well. They tried everything, applying vinegar, burning herbs, bathing in cold water, even praying before bleeding patients. They hung garlic and crosses on windows, both as a cure and a plea. In dark houses, people whispered about the spirits of the plague, ghosts said to carry disease, drifting through markets, sneaking into children's dreams. Whether superstition or desperation, everyone believed in something. No news, no medicine, no salvation was strong enough to fight the terror spreading across the colonies. And then amid that darkness, something almost miraculous appeared, the idea that disease could be prevented. It began not in London or Paris, but in distant parts of Asia, where people had long practiced inoculation, introducing a small amount of virus into the body to create immunity. Rumors of this method reached the West like a tale of wonder. Colonial doctors heard that in Turkey, women injected powder from dried pustules into their children's skin, and those children would never get sick again. To Europeans, it sounded like magic or madness. But when death was knocking on every door, madness was the only hope left. The first experiments happened in secret. A few brave or desperate doctors mixed powder from dried pustules with small cuts on patients' arms. Some survived and they never caught the disease again. Others, less fortunate, died within days. But strangely, the doctors began to record their results. They noticed the survival rate was higher than letting the disease run its course. Gradually, inoculation spread to the colonies, though met with fierce resistance. The church called it defiance of God's will, and the people called it self-poisoning. But among the survivors, a new belief slowly took shape, that perhaps humanity was not entirely helpless before fate. One of the strongest advocates for this method was not a doctor, but an African slave named Onesimus. He told his master, a minister in Boston, about the practice of mild infection that had saved thousands in his homeland. His story made the minister, Cotton Mather, a man who once believed in witch hunts, reconsider the meaning of science and faith. Thanks to Onesimus, a trial of inoculation was carried out during the 1721 outbreak, saving hundreds of lives. It was a rare moment when knowledge once despised, the knowledge of slaves, of outsiders, changed the course of Western medical history. Yet not everyone was saved. Smallpox continued to spread terror throughout the 18th century. It did more than kill, it shaped politics. Many leaders, from George Washington to Catherine the Great, faced it not just as a disease, but as a strategic threat. Washington, who nearly died of smallpox, ordered the vaccination of the entire American Revolutionary Army, a decision considered a turning point in their victory. Meanwhile, in Europe, fear of smallpox drove royals into isolation, sealed rooms, and ritual baths in strong spirits, as if luxury could ward off death. For ordinary people, smallpox was a generational horror. Mothers held their children close, waiting for the first small spots to appear on their skin. Priests went from house to house, giving last rites to those still breathing. The survivors, their faces scarred, stood as living proof of an era where life and death were only a breath apart. And while the world struggled against the plague, doctors continued to believe the ancient theory of the four humors could explain everything. But beneath that old knowledge, a new wave was rising. Young doctors trained in Europe began to ask, if disease didn't come from imbalance, then where did it come from? They saw what their predecessors had ignored, that illness could spread through contact, that air, water, and the body all played a role. Though they had no concept of bacteria or viruses, the first seeds of modern medicine began to sprout in rooms filled with the scent of herbs and burning candles. Smallpox would reign for nearly another century, until a man named Edward Jenner, who had also witnessed thousands die, noticed that milkmaids who caught a mild illness called cowpox seemed immune to real smallpox. From that simple observation, Jenner created the first vaccination and, unknowingly, opened a new chapter for humanity. But in the colonial era, that was still a distant dream. There, smallpox remained king, and humans were still mere pawns in nature's game. Yet even in that despair, one thing never disappeared: the will to survive. Trembling hands still prepared medicine, like mothers still prayed by their cradles, and healers, whether using leeches, knives, or herbs, still believed that saving lives was their duty, even at the cost of blood. As the 19th century unfolded, the world entered an age of inventions, but also an age of illusions. People believed they had touched the secret of life, but in truth they had only begun to grasp its complexity. Industrial cities rose with coal smoke and the grinding of gears, and with them came new diseases: cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, the silent killers of the modern world. People no longer died from arrows or swords, but from a drop of dirty water or a lingering cough. Medicine was no longer the tool of healers, but became a weapon in the hands of the curious. In damp laboratories in Paris, London, and Berlin, scientists began to see the world through a new lens, the microscope. There, in every drop of blood, every speck of dust, they saw tiny creatures that centuries earlier had been called demons, now given an official name: germs. Louis Pasteur, a quiet man whose gaze never left the microscope, proved that life did not arise from nothing. He boiled, sterilized, and purified, and showed the world that disease had real culprits. The germ theory of disease was born, shaking the foundations of both classical medicine and theology. Humanity was no longer punished by God, but attacked by invisible beings, and strangely, that realization brought relief. But with every advance came skepticism. Many conservative doctors called Pasteur a madman, claiming that germs were just ghosts in a bottle. They did not know that, not far away in England, a Scottish doctor named Joseph Lister was quietly proving the opposite. He began spraying carbolic acid on instruments and wounds before surgery. The result? His patients no longer died from post-operative infections. A simple act, but one that saved millions. For the first time in history, the scalpel was no longer a symbol of fear, but of hope. From then on, medicine entered an age of sterility and infinity. Operating rooms were lit by electricity. Doctors donned white coats, a color symbolizing both cleanliness and trust. Ether and chloroform opened the door to artificial sleep, allowing humans to endure surgeries that once would have killed them from pain. Hospitals, once places where the poor awaited death, became temples of science. Yet behind every advancement lurked the shadow of ethics. Many experiments on the human body were conducted without consent. From orphanages and prisons to colonies, medicine sought answers in the suffering of the voiceless. Some doctors justified their acts by saying they sacrificed a few to save many, but the question hung in the air: can life be built upon the suffering of others? In Europe, Florence Nightingale, the woman with the lamp, proved that compassion could also be a form of science. She did not invent medicine, but she invented care. During the Crimean War, she took notes, observed, drew mortality charts, and realized that cleanliness, order, and nutrition were as vital as any drug. Her white angels transformed the nursing profession, once scorned, into a symbol of courage and sacrifice. When war spread again in the early 20th century, these advances were tested in the smoke of battle. For the first time, people witnessed ambulances, surgeries performed on the front lines, and doctors carrying syringes instead of swords. But World War I brought something else: wounds of the soul. Soldiers returned not only with scarred bodies, but with shattered minds. From that moment, psychiatry, a field once ridiculed, was taken seriously. Humanity began to understand that not only the body can bleed. At the same time, an old enemy returned, the influenza pandemic of 1918. It killed more than 50 million people, more than the war itself. But unlike in the Middle Ages, this time humanity had weapons: medical statistics, hospitals, laboratories, and from the ashes of countless bodies, public health was born, with the mission not just to heal individuals, but to protect entire communities. From here, humanity began to understand that medicine was not merely about inventions, but a long war between knowledge and arrogance. Every generation of doctors believed they knew everything until a new pathogen appeared, forcing them to start learning again. Yet perhaps in that cycle, medicine became more human. The 19th century closed under the light of the microscope, but opened the 20th with an even greater dream: mastering life itself. Penicillin was discovered, not in a sterile laboratory, but in a forgotten dish where mold had grown. A coincidence that saved millions, reminding humanity that sometimes science advances not through perfection, but through mistakes. That is the eternal paradox of medicine. It is the art of imperfection, yet it strives for perfection. From blood-soaked tents to brightly lit laboratories, from prayers to chemical formulas, humans have always sought to prolong the most fragile miracle of all: life itself. And after thousands of years, the old question still echoes, no different from the time of ancient healers: how well do we truly understand our own bodies? Perhaps the greatest secret of medicine lies not in test tubes or scalpels, but in the human heart itself, the fear of loss and the longing to live.